Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for this session of the Oxford Karl Popper Society. I'm very pleased to announce that Bart Vanderhaegen will give a talk today. And Bart will talk about what companies can learn from Popper, and Popper's emphasis on the importance of error correction is of great value to organizations, and at the same time, it's the main source of problems related to both productivity and engagement in organizations. And Bart has developed a management approach that applies Popper's ideas to companies, and he will go through those ideas and explain how they drive problem solving and how they are different from the prevailing approaches in management. And I should say beforehand that Bart can be found on Twitter. We will link to his Twitter page as well as LinkedIn. And with that introduction, I'm very pleased to give the floor to Bart. Bart, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Sam. So good evening, everyone. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Liberty, for having me. It's a real pleasure. And so, yes, I will be talking about creating open management systems in organizations, show you a little bit my thinking around it, how I apply it in everyday life as a management consultant, and also how the works of Karl Popper and David Deutsch have influenced me. And so I have a couple of topics lined up here. So first of all, I want to talk about how I bumped into epistemology, and you can take that fairly literally. It was bumping into it by accident. I had no plans or nothing planned for me to encounter the subject. Some examples of bad epistemology in organizations. Then the problem I fell in love with, so paraphrasing Popper here, the problem I spent my professional life solving with a current tentative solution, which I would like to share as a system for creating open management systems, and then closing up with some considerations about the feasibility or whether all of this is realistic. So how I bumped into epistemology. So let me maybe first start with a very brief history of management methods. So according to a survey of Harvard, there are about 15,000 management books, all explaining methods about how to run, how to manage companies. And you could look at them along several classifications. So either what they do on processes and products, what they do regarding how to organize work in a company, and what they do around, how we treat people in a company. And so maybe here, not to go into all of this, but the start is maybe interesting. So the first management book was written in 1910 by Frederick Taylor, by the way, not the mathematician, but the US engineer who wrote a book which is called The Principles of Scientific Management. And it was based on 4 pillars. So 4 pillars of how to manage a company. The first pillar was the idea that what gets measured gets done. So in a company, you have to measure the output, you have to measure the time that people spent on their work, compare it with other teams, with history, with forecasts, benchmark everything in order to improve the whole. The second pillar of the book was about standardization. So we shouldn't be doing a lot of fancy things that customers are requesting. We should standardize things. Also, Taylor introduced the concepts of rewards and punishments. So people that were performing well could get bonuses. Other people that didn't could get fired. And then the fourth pillar of the book was around the idea that all the thinking should be removed from the operation. So Taylor said that the factory floor should be removed from all creative thinking, and we should consolidate the thinking in what he called a planning department. And that gave actually rise to the concept of a manager. So the first manager was a planner who was instructing the factory floor on how to run the operations and therefore remove everything that is thinking from operations. This led to the Taylorism doctrine, and as you see on the slide, many additional methods have been invented since then in very different categories of topics, and altogether 15,000 roughly management books. And so also I encountered all of those methods over the past 20 years. And I want to share a little bit how my reasoning actually evolved. So when I started out, let's say 20 years ago, roughly, I thought everything about management was about performance and engagement. So you need to be efficient, effective, and at the same time engage people, because if you're only driving performance without engaged people, you will lose the performance. And so managers should actually apply all the relevant management methods that directly impact performance and engagement. So 10 years ago, roughly, I thought that something has to be behind all of this. And then I somewhat discovered that it's essentially behavior that is driving performance and engagement. Performance is what it is because people do what they do. And also around behavior, there's a lot of management methods being written. For example, self-determination theory, which is a theory where you are improving behaviors also based on intrinsic motivators like autonomy, flow, purpose, as opposed to only through extrinsic motivators, which are the rewards and punishment type of motivators that drive behavior. And so essentially behavior was causing the performance and the engagement that you saw in organizations. And then 5 years ago, roughly, by accident, I discovered the works of David Deutsch and then Karl Popper. And really, what is lying beyond even behavior is the ideas and the theories that are in people's minds. Simply for the fact or the simple fact of logic that you can't act upon a theory that you don't hold in your mind. You're not acting upon the theories that are written in books or the theories that are in the minds of your manager or your colleagues. And those theories don't correspond. So if you really want to change behavior to have as a consequence that performance and engagement improves, then it is a matter of dealing with the ideas and the theories that are in people's minds. And then you come to epistemology and more specifically critical rationalism. And so since 5 years, I'm really convinced that the thing that managers have to do is to basically organize problem solving and provide the means for error correction, because that's the way that theories and ideas in people's minds will evolve, will improve, and subsequently drive behavior and subsequently drive performance and engagement. So this is a little retrospective on 20 years of experience and how epistemology and specifically critical rationalism played a very important role in my current thinking about management. I think it matters a lot, epistemology. Basically, organizations are places where many people with many different subjective opinions sit very close to each other and are constantly under time pressure. So it is a crucial thing to understand and to deal with these theories about what to improve, how to improve, and why to improve. And epistemology provides answers there. Surprisingly, epistemology is never addressed in management books. None of those 15,000 books actually mentions epistemology, let alone critical rationalism. And also in MBA educations, you don't come across the concept. I have an MBA myself, and never was there anything on epistemology. Now, as most of you probably know, we have two main theories about how knowledge is created in our minds and how it grows. And so we have critical rationalism from Karl Popper versus justified through belief epistemology. In critical rationalism, really, we consider our knowledge to consist of fallible guesses that we can always improve by actively seeking for errors in our knowledge. And when we improve our knowledge, our ideas become really good explanations about how the world behaves, how the company behaves, and why. So critical rationalism allows an open-ended growth of knowledge because we're searching or trying to get closer to objective truth. All of this, as opposed to justified through belief epistemology, where we're really trying to label our knowledge as being certain, and where we're immunizing it from criticism in this kind of passive effort to hold on to certain knowledge. The why question, when we're seeking explanation, is typically answered by referring to some infallible source of knowledge. So why is something so? Well, because X said so, and X is an authority, and X knows for sure how things are. Justified through belief epistemology leads to closed knowledge systems and is basically the search for subjective certainty. Now, there is a lot of justified through belief, bad epistemology in organizations, and I want to discuss some negative consequences of justified through belief. So basically, when people think that the only appropriate claims are justified through beliefs, you get two options. Either people are afraid to speak up, and so they keep valuable inexplicit knowledge to themselves, inexplicit knowledge that could have solved important problems, or on the other hand, they resort to very general claims, like claims that are always true, or claims about things that are far into the future, claims that can be said about every problem situation while not really solving the situation or advancing anything about the problem situation. And additionally, justified through belief also breeds camps that are more and more opposing, more and more polarized, because if what I say is justified in truth, then other people saying something else is logically wrong. And so that adds to the polarization in companies. Next up, I want to take you through a list of some household management statements for which I personally changed my mind about after encountering the work of Karl Popper and David Deutsch, but really household things that you really hear a lot on a daily basis in companies. And I bring them in two columns, so my former errors and then my current preferred errors. What you see on the slide is the thing that managers spend their whole day looking at, or large parts of the day. So it's numbers, trends, forecasts, colors like the green, the orange, and the red. And so I used to believe that when you look at these things, you could confidently say that the facts are the facts and they show us the way. But now my preferred statement is that all observations are theory laden. Any fact can still be explained by many possible contradictory explanations, and you can't derive an idea from a fact. You can't derive an idea to improve a fact from that very fact. Other example is like when companies do big moves and change strategy and launch a whole series of initiatives, then they pull in a lot of colleagues of the company and they explain and communicate in large sessions. And so they say to themselves, so we need to tell people very, very clearly so they will understand and follow it. So now I believe, and I've learned, that you can't pour knowledge into people. Understanding something is an active process and not a passive process of receiving. And additionally, you can't avoid being misunderstood, as Popper tells us. Some more things, household management claims. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Well, it's actually impossible that two problem situations are identical, and there are no infallible sources of knowledge, with all due respect for the inventor of the wheel here. History shows us that we need to do this and this and this, because history tells us that, well, the future does not resemble the past. Induction doesn't work. Happiness at work is a primary goal to work on. After reading Popper, I understand that happiness at work is basically a consequence of being able to solve problems, having the autonomy and the help to solve problems. And then happiness is a consequence, but not something that we can like directly access in order to improve. We first need a grand vision and a blueprint before we start to do anything else. Well, today I'm thinking that we will get through our goals eventually through piecemeal error correction. And the first version of our vision, the first version of the blueprint doesn't really matter. It's the evolution of the idea that matters. Reaching a compromise is a success. Well, actually, everybody around the table believes that another idea will work better. So compromises are actually not good. That person is really fit or unfit for the job according to some personality test. Well, I think it's the error of holism. It's explaining the part, a person's ID, only in terms of the whole, the person. And so you neglect the content of a specific ID and also even its potential evolution by making such claims. Let's send people to general training programs, for example. Well, people only learn by doing, by trying, by making errors, and not by having knowledge poured into their mind. And all problem situations are unique, so why try to copy them in some artificial separate training setting? So the list is not exhaustive, but I wanted to give a flavor of a couple of very household claims in management, which I somewhat radically changed my mind about. And so what is this problem now I fell in love with and I'm spending my professional life trying to solve? Well, I go back here to the criterion of Karl Popper about good political systems. So in his book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, he says that when we're thinking about politics, we're basically asking ourselves the wrong questions. We're trying to ask the question, who should rule? And so who is infallibly perfect that we can elect into power and that then will solve all problems that come along? Instead of that question, there's another question which is much more relevant, and that is the question of how can we set things up so bad rulers and bad policies can be removed without violence. And so really the question about how can we error correct without violence, as opposed to trying to search for the perfect leader who will infallibly solve all political problems and advance the nation or the country in that way. And so given that I think that that idea has a lot of reach, I've extended it into management, where also there's a lot of effort being spent on questions like, who is the right person in the right place for the job? And also there in management, I think that is the wrong question. The better question is how to set things up so bad ideas can be removed and improved without increased disengagement. So fairly similar to the question that Popper asked for political systems, and here transferred to management. And so this is the problem I fell in love with, so to say. How can we set things up so bad ideas can be removed and improved, but without increased disengagement? Or stated differently, how can we create open management systems with open-ended knowledge creation and increasing engagement? So my solution to this problem then, first of all, you could ask why bother? I mean, is there even a management method? There are 15,000 management books written. So you could have, I think, three camps in answering this question. So the yes camp and the no camp, and then the camp in between. The yes camp obviously says there are management methods, they are prescriptive. You can measure how much you have implemented of the method. They are universally applicable as well. That's the right-hand side. The left-hand side would be somewhat comparable to the philosopher of science, Paul Feyerabend, who says anything goes. There's no real method for doing science. There's no consistent thing that that scientists do. In management, honestly, I don't know whether there are management philosophers or thinkers that are in this camp on the left, but I would welcome them because they would at least stir up things that are being developed on the right-hand side in the yes camp. Personally, I'm in the middle, and I think, well, it's neither yes nor no. The only criterion we have to worry about when developing management methods is basically considering whether errors are entrenched or whether we provide the means of error correction. And so we will mistakes when we select any of those methods on the right, and we will also make mistakes when we are choosing to say that anything goes, which was what Feyerabend said. Instead, we just have to really make sure that we are not entrenching errors and that we're providing enough means to correct error. So how do we do this then? This is the logic of my system, the Pactify system. So we start from problems. So we don't start from methods that we keep fixed. Methods are there merely as starting points used to seek for errors. Then it is about evolving ideas into good explanations to solve those problems, and at the same time evolve towards more real cooperation while solving those problems together. And those two things, the evolution towards good explanations and more real cooperation, is basically through the means of error correction. And there's something particular about these means of error corrections. Well, they have to be available to more and more people in the organization. It shouldn't be something exclusive. They have to be safeguarded by those with power, which is actually my definition of a manager. It's somebody who uses his or her power to safeguard the means of error correction. And it should also be means that can be practiced while doing, so people can really get better at it. They shouldn't be too mechanical or theoretical or being taught by or via trainings. People should be able to practice them in the action, in their everyday life and their everyday work. A little word about explanations in management. So an explanation in management is basically a statement about what to change, transform, and improve, how to do that, and why to do it in that particular way and not a different way. And so when thinking about this way, you see the household things appearing. So you need a goal, you need some kind of approach, some steps, milestones, actions, but also good reasons why. So good explanations why that course of action is actually being proposed. And so I want to go even a little bit further and saying that there is a mode of explanation for a management idea. And here I've sketched a little bit how I think it should look like, because I think an idea, and especially an explanation, is not something that you just scribble on a post-it note. There is much more to it. You have to start from a problem that you intend to solve. There has to be some statement about a goal, an approach, a plan. There have to be a series of consistent statements about actions and milestones in the past, so choices, results that have been achieved in the past. There has to be a series of consistent statements about actions and milestones in the future. At any time, you need a status that basically connects what the past with the future. There's some end goal at the end. And also critically, you have to have an account of why that particular course of action and why not some different course of action, which really makes the idea an explanation. And so all of this you can't just scribble on a post-it note. The error correction then is basically all the differences with the previous version of the idea and the explanation. That is explanations on the one hand, but I think we also have to cooperate and evolve towards real cooperation while solving problems together. Problem solving and cooperation should be treated as inseparable. So, as I said, problem solving is about the evolution of any given first idea towards a good explanation. Well, at the same time and in conjunction with problem solving, I think we have to evolve cooperation. And you can think about various stages of cooperation, from very low cooperation to very high cooperation. I've put 3 possible states of cooperation here. But imagine very low cooperation. What would that be? That is just a bunch or a troop of people that are somewhat forced together to solve a problem, but that basically ignore each other. So they don't know what the others do or think, and it's just a bunch acting somewhat together. Working apart together would be already one step further. There is some common goal. So people are working towards some common goal that they agreed upon, but still there is no real sharedness of an explanation. People are doing their thing on the side, and they assume that somehow, some way, everything will fall into place and come together, and the common goal will be reached. And if that's not the case, then they expect that force will do that, and that some manager will come in at some point in time and reshuffle the whole thing, and tell everybody again what to do in order to get to the common goal. But there's no real sharedness of explanation. Real cooperation is the situation where you have a shared explanation, and people share really the core of the explanation about how to solve the problem. And improving the shared explanation is even more important than having your own little bits fixed in it. And that's when you have real cooperation. So I think cooperation is about how shared an explanation is and how shared its error correction is. And so, yes, you can depict it a little bit like this, with 4 people who have many ideas that are not shared, but there is a shared explanation which ideally grows and gets more shared. And that is where you evolve towards more cooperation. And so the explanation, its evolution, and how it can be improved becomes more and more a shared objective thing rather than a collection of different subjective opinions. So the third part of the solution is basically these means of error correction that are both going to drive problem solving and the evolution towards good explanations, and at the same time drive the evolution towards more real cooperation. But let me first say what means of error corrections are in, well, particularly in management, but maybe also more generally. There are some practical rules and tools that promote error correction. They are permanent as long as they're active and not suppressed. So they allow to build a tradition of error correction as opposed to some one-off efforts only, or a cycle of efforts like things going up and then going down again in some cyclical movement. And the means of error correction is also something that, well, encourages you to make errors faster and earlier, at a time when those errors are not yet doing any harm, and correct them to prevent that they eventually do harm. So the opposite of a means of error correction is anything that structurally entrenches errors, so any rules that are aimed at keeping knowledge static. Statements like, for example, we shouldn't question this anymore, or similar statements. In politics, we know of one very well-known means of error correction, which is elections, organizing elections. And so Pactify is a management system for problem solving, which also introduces means of error corrections. We've figured out 9 of them. There could be more, there could be less, but at least these are the 9 means of error corrections that are going to both evolve ideas towards better explanations and create more real cooperation. And so I want to go, but maybe more quickly, into all of, or across all of them. So here are the 9 listed. First of all, we want to mandate problems to interesting teams. We want teams that bring the knowledge that is interesting, probably also, or ideally even a lot of inexplicit knowledge. So don't take the usual volunteers, for example, and bring them together in a specific team with a mandate to solve a problem. A mandate that can include requirements for how a solution should look like, but with enough autonomy as at least as well. Second one is those teams are then mandated with a problem to start a process of problem solving. And there's not a lot of top-down rules, but there are some minimal rules. Like, for example, you have to come to group meetings and individual meetings, and there is no end date to the series of meetings. So problems are inevitable. So never fear that you run out of interesting problems to solve. That's another means that we introduce. Rumination time as well, which is basically the organizing of meeting time that is dedicated to thinking without too much bias for action. So it is time dedicated to understanding the problem, to sharing information. It's what the cows do when they digest. So the same food passes through different stomachs. And it allows to let people get some grip on the problem, learn from the exchange of info, and develop first ideas without real pressure. Another means of error correction is what we call ID ownership. It's the idea that anyone on the team can pursue any idea to solve a problem, provided that he or she documents it as an explanation. So according to what I've illustrated as mode of explanation, and that explanation passes an align gate, a consent of the team. And so then we try to stretch the autonomy as long as the idea progresses instead of killing it too soon. And this promotes error correction really because people, when people are convinced of their idea, they'll use the autonomy most effectively to correct errors and to improve their ideas. And as a side step, shortly, there is this American company I came across. It's not a client, but they do something similarly and maybe a little bit more extreme. So any person can make any decision in that company based on two conditions. The decision needs to be transparent. It needs to be made transparent. And the person has to request advice from a minimum of two parties. But then whatever the advice is, the person can still decide what he or she wanted to decide. And so this holds for every decision that can be made in that company, including people's own salary. So if I were to work in that company, I could propose to raise my own salary by 5%, provided that I make my decision transparent and that I have requested advice from at least two parties in the company. And even if they would have discouraged me from raising my salary, I would still be entitled to do that. And somehow, some way, this works. This far-fetched giving of autonomy is actually turning out really well. Other means of error correction that we introduce, we have a specific software platform that supports the problem-solving process and the 9 means of error correction. One platform, one place with one version of the explanation promotes error correction. The transparency does it well. And when you have one place where the ideas are kept and nurtured, that is actually also a way of basically improving them. Everyone takes the pen. That's another rule, another means of error correction. So everybody has to write down their things in the software, their parts of the explanations. IDs, why does it promote error correction? Well, basically because when you write IDs down, they become objective knowledge and thus easier to correct mistakes. And when everybody takes the pen, there is no need for a central reporting function who would, in any case, make mistakes in interpreting what everyone would have written down. So taking the pen, everybody taking the pen is a very effective means to correct errors. We have the aligned gate for an ID. So all IDs have to pass an aligned gate where the team consents to the explanation as it is at that moment in time. That promotes error correction because a team can still enhance the idea of an ID owner, and cooperation is shaped around an evolving ID as opposed to cooperation being commanded onto a fixed ID that can never or that cannot be improved anymore. There are facilitator roles and questions in our process. So different players can take up facilitator roles and essentially facilitate error correction. They could be external, so external facilitators, or it could be the hierarchy who takes up this role as a facilitator. A facilitator has the right to ask questions in the team, but doesn't give his or her own IDs. So he or she remains in the question. Facilitation promotes error correction in the way that the answers improve the explanations, making them harder to vary, more aligned. And also the facilitator actually actively helps people to become better and succeed at error correction. And then the last means of error correction that we apply is basically fine-tuning all of the previous ones. So periodically reviewing with management to fine-tune the introduction of the different means of error correction, the timing with which and the intensity. And that is to catch mistakes in how well the means of error corrections actually are doing their job. So this was a bit the 9 means of error corrections that we introduce, which compose the system. And now just to close off some considerations about is this even, this way of working, is this possible? With the first question, like, is open-ended knowledge growth even possible? Well, I have my unscientific formula for progress here, basically saying that progress in a given system over a period of time is somewhat the difference between the errors that are corrected versus the errors that are the new errors that are being introduced. And so, yes, I think open-ended knowledge growth is possible, because I think error correction is a universal skill of everyone, and error introduction, on the other hand, is merely a tendency. It's not an active pursuit for most of us, at least. And so the first term in the difference will always be weighing higher than the second one. Even if almost all people adopt justified through belief epistemology, at least they are not introducing extra errors. So again, if a minimum of people are correcting errors, then this equation still turns out positive. And I know you can't add IDs and you can't subtract IDs, but still it's a way of reasoning. And it's the reason why I'm optimistic about the possibility of open-ended knowledge growth. And then finally, can this work? Well, Popper also says we can start anywhere. So there are no complicated rules about how to set things up. Our knowledge can be improved anywhere, from the top, from the bottom, from the left, from the right. So there is a lot of flexibility, and you can start very small and then grow the momentum onto more problems and more teams. Also, error correction can be learned in the action by everyone. You don't need a special gift to become good at error correction. You can get good at it if you practice it. However, I do need one thing, which I call an anchor point, which is one manager in the company who I call half a Popperian with power. So luckily, nobody is 100% justified through belief. And if you, as a manager, have at least some affinity to critical rationalism, then that is a starting point to launch these kinds of efforts. Power is also needed. Because and not to use the power, not to use for bad purposes. For example, bad purposes to use power is telling people what to do and telling people what to do without giving an explanation for why. but there are rightful uses of power. You can use power as a manager to distribute problems, give mandates to the organization, and instantiate the means of error correction. And finally, yes, why do I find this so interesting in organizations as opposed to politics? I think we can do much more in organizations. There's more flexibility. There are possibly also more means of error corrections. In politics, you see a fairly slow rate of innovation in the means of error correction. So it has taken ages to get to democracy, elections, and the rate of innovation of the means of error correction is fairly slow. And I think it's the opposite in organizations. So that's one of the reasons why I'm also positive and keen on doing these kinds of things in organizations as opposed to in the field of politics. So this is what I wanted to share with you, and interested to hear some feedback or questions.
Yeah, I think I'll start off the question session by asking that you gave a very theoretical framework, which I liked, and at various points you nicely clarified how companies actually work. So I think it's slide 5 or something. You had this diagram in which you showed there were various people in the company, all of which had different ideas, and there needs to be some kind of way of addressing that. And I imagine that in real companies, like there will be discussion sessions, or there will be points at which people get to exchange ideas. And I'm wondering how in like how in a real world company, what kinds of behaviors you're asking people to change. So are you saying, for example, that in these discussion sessions, the aim of the discussion session should be different, or that the way people go about them should be different? Or is there another, like what you might call another tradition that companies often use to promote error correction that you want to change? Like kind of fleshing out the details of how this would go about in real life. Because again, I think I very much agree with the theory, and I'm wondering how it applies to real life situations.
Yeah, so the application to real life is basically not by giving the theory, but by letting the problem-solving process do the work, so to say. And so really engaging in real and concrete problems, not fictitious problems or imaginary problems, or giving too much theory about this is the behavior that we want, this is the behavior that we have today, we have this gap to close. Those things are what I call out of the action. In the action means we take a relevant and interesting problem, we try to solve it with a group of people that we ask to solve it, to solve that problem, and then we develop ideas, we go through this process of rumination, we ask ID owners to document their ideas, their explanations, we go through consent gates, and so it's really around the content of an ID that solves a problem and how people contribute to that ID without really stipulating like policies or procedures that people have to follow.
Right.
So no training required. We can literally, start tomorrow with a problem and a team, and really focus on the content of the ideas that are being developed as attempts to solve those problems.
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense.
I would say, as opposed to sending people into trainings and explaining them the theory of problem solving. That is what we would not do. That's maybe what I just did, but that is not what we're actually doing, because that doesn't work. You can't pour that kind of knowledge into people. They have to experience it based on real problems, real ideas, and real evolution of ideas.
Yeah, so a follow-up question would be that you seem to want to give everyone in the company more autonomy, and that's something I would agree with. But a criticism that I can imagine people having is, well, some people just need to be told what to do. For example, if someone is asked to build a website for, say, a large company, something like Apple maybe, then Apple has certain requirements and they just really want you to meet those requirements, and they don't want to have to discuss with you how you implement their ideas. And that seems to be opposed to the kind of critical discussions that you're laying out here. Do you think they're compatible? Do you think that my example is unrealistic? How would you deal with that?
Yeah. Well, the example I gave of the US company is really open, and they went through a lot of evolution before being able to give so much and so far-reaching autonomy. The way we go about it is, at the start, there is a mandate to solve a problem by a particular team, in which you describe as the hierarchy or the manager the requirements that you want to see fulfilled in a solution. But those requirements, they can be very close. They can stipulate everything, and there is no autonomy left. And it depends a little bit, well, and you can have the situation where the mandate is quite open, where you don't put a lot of requirements. And the choice between an open mandate or a closed mandate depends a lot on like the prevailing culture, the past culture. And but my experience is that, managers tend to exaggerate when they say we can't give so much autonomy because people will not have ideas, or people will not be able to cooperate and get to better ideas. They tend to exaggerate that a little bit, and I'm pushing back on it. But at the same time, giving completely open mandates to teams that have never been used to this and have never been asked the question, and have always been, been in situations where they are told what to do, that will not work as well. But there's definitely plenty of room for improvement, and we're over exaggerating the statements like, we cannot ask that to our people, or people will not come with ideas. So that is something which I would not follow. On the other hand, pulling everything open from the one day to the other will not work either.
Right. And I guess that in my example, in the real world, there would actually be discussion sessions. Like if someone is making it, if someone has been hired to make a website, they'll produce certain examples, and those examples will be discussed, and there'll be feedback, and it's much less top down than I'm portraying it in the example. And yes, that's how it would accommodate your framework more.
And when I work, for example, with managers also, I'm trying to introduce the idea that they still arbitrate between solutions as opposed to always giving their own solution. So if you refrain to arbitrating, then you still allow people to come up with good ideas, but you can still say no. But the worst thing to do is to say, thank you for the work, but we're going to do this. And when you refrain from doing that and go into arbitration mode, then you can still say no, but at the same time, you leave enough room for ideas to evolve in a team.
Right. Yeah, I like that. Excellent. Okay, we have some questions in the chat, which which I can either read, or the people in question can ask them themselves. For example, Josh, would you like to pose your question? If not, then I will read it for you. The question is, what is the role of incentives rewards for promoting good ideas within the framework, within your framework?
The straight answer is I ignore them. They come at the end of the year, and they shouldn't really affect ideation, idea evolution. Well, they are there somewhere in the background, and behavior is driven by them. But I've seen situations where people really go from being in a problem-solving process where they're really only thinking about what is my position here, how am I going to go out or get out of this or come out of this, towards a position where really, as I said, they find it more important to improve the shared explanation as opposed to, you know, their little bit in it and having their bit fixed in it. And that transition only takes place if the rewards and the punishments become second, third, or lesser priority. And when people really engage in problem solving and yeah, really get driven by improving an explanation as opposed to thinking about consequences that only relate to their position, their reward, or their punishment. And that's possible. That's not some imaginary thing to want to pursue.
Yeah, I also very much like that. It's nice that you're treating kind of the differences between how companies face, for example, competition in the market through prices and price incentives and things like that, and the internal structure of the company. Like there's a dividing line, which I think you draw up, and the way that the company is incentivized to make more money is not necessarily the way that it should incentivize its own workers, or rather it can use those incentives, but there's better incentives that they can also apply.
Yes.
And I like that. It reminds me of, I think sometimes libertarians have this idea that, for example, interpersonal relationships should really be more like transactions. And I think that's wrong. And I think it makes some sense that internal company structures, although they are more transactional than interpersonal relationships are in general, that they are not as transactional as the rest of the market, or for example, how companies deal with one another. So again, that's the thing I like about your construction. Yeah, there's another question in the chat, which I will read. It's by Stefan. The question is, do you find that people are sometimes resistant to making errors in front of others or correcting each other's errors? And if so, what do you do to address these social world type of problems?
Yeah, that's the really good point and an important question. So there are degrees of exposure to error correction that people can deal with. And of course, if you turn up the transparency like too quickly and expose all of the explanations to a lot of people, like very transparently, people are going to be afraid and are going to refrain from engaging into more problem solving. You can manage that by going in much slower steps, like piecemeal even. I have, as a facilitator, when I accompany these processes, I also have bi-weekly meetings with the individuals on the team. So we have bi-weekly group meetings, but I also have bi-weekly individual meetings. And the individual meeting is like the safest place. Nothing escapes from those meetings. And so you can build on the confidence to correct errors transparently already in an individual setting, in a one-on-one, like very safe. But gradually, when you become more confident, like you can deal with more transparency, more feedback, even from other teams, first of all from other team members, but then maybe even from other teams. But transparency is definitely something that you have to manage and almost be very careful in the steps that you augment it with, because transparency can also make people afraid. And so it's important. This is, by the way, the 9th means of error correction, is that we review all the means. So with management, I'm also sitting together to see, are we not going too fast with this transparency? I mean, are people, are they keeping up? Are they making enough progress? Are they being successful enough? And if not, we have to slow down, or we have to do things differently. But transparency and the reach of transparency is definitely such a thing that you have to be careful about in the beginning before really, growing it.
Very nice. Then could I maybe ask you to close the presentation, by the way, because then I will have a clear view of you for the recording. Or sorry, the stop the screen sharing is, yeah, there we go. Excellent, thanks. And I also, yeah, again, if anyone has any questions, you can either raise your hand or you can post it in the chat and I can read it for you. I think I wanted to add a bit to that question that was just asked by saying that it's not just in company structures, but also in education, in lectures, in talks in general, that I really noticed that people are kind of afraid of asking questions almost. Like there is a certain tendency to be embarrassed and to refrain from saying something that you might think is dumb, but that you are like legitimately curious about. And I often wonder how much, for example, economic value just gets destroyed by people not asking the right questions at the right time. Because it's usually the case that if you have a question, then other people also have a question. Although, you know, that's the thing we're all, of course, afraid about, is that that's not the case, and that we're addressing something that everyone else understands completely, and we're just pointing out something obvious. And so I like the reach of your idea there.
And so one of my favorite example, or the thing that I find very interesting, is like call center people or factory workers. They typically have huge amounts of inexplicit knowledge, but nobody ever asks them a question. But when you do, you really understand a lot about the company. And it's sometimes a couple of people, only a handful, that really know how the company is really working and what would happen if we change this, what would be the consequence and the effects of it. And they have huge amounts of inexplicit knowledge, but nobody ever asked them. And you can ask them because they developed all that inexplicit knowledge simply because they're interested as well in the company. So you wouldn't bother building up all that knowledge if you weren't interested. So it's just a matter of asking the question, and they will open up.
Very nice. Yeah, I think this is something that Ronald Coase called transaction costs, where different parts of, say, a company don't know what the other parts are doing, and communication between those parts is difficult. And then you kind of get what you just described, where certain people know a lot about how the company's run, but not everyone's aware that they're aware of this. I see we have some more questions in the chat. Another question is, how do you go about designing the software to support these processes?
With the paper and a pen. So I wrote everything myself, really thinking about, you know, how would a good problem-solving process work? How can we integrate these means of error correction? And really have what it essentially is a place where you keep the ideas. You have a lot of software systems in companies that spit out data, dashboards, ERP systems, but those are all systems that basically give you the facts. I wanted to make a software system where we could see and keep and nurture and evolve the ideas that are going to change the facts. And not a lot of companies have this. When I go to company presentations and they explain everything they have and all the software system they have, all the equipments they have running, my question always is, and yes, and where do you keep the ideas? And then I get no answer. They're showing me lots of data systems and everything they can measure, but not a lot of companies have a place where they keep their ideas that will eventually improve all those facts. Well, the ideas are in the minds of managers and in the minds of people, but they're not really made objective and made shared, and in a way that they really read as ideas and not like disconnected pieces of information that are scribbled down and that not really consist of a good idea or a good explanation. And that is what I wanted to make with this software. And yes, I did it by just writing all the different screens by hand and keeping it very simply, because one of the means of error correction is also that I want that everybody takes the pen, so it cannot be complicated. So it's a very light system where everybody can take the pen, and where the ideas literally are being developed and evolved.
Nice. I was wondering, are more companies? I very so the only thing I know about this really is like the kinds of software I sometimes use, and also ads and things like that, in which I see people using ever more software for using together. So it seems like the kind of software that you're developing, that there are similar kinds of software that are now being used in the market, although they're probably going to be very distinct from yours because you had a specific aim in mind in a very critical rationalist point of view that you wanted to use in developing the software. But do you think that these kinds of programs are becoming more widespread and are aiding people in problem solving together?
Yeah, there is a whole range of applications, commercial applications that purport to accommodate for problem solving and teamwork. Very powerful softwares with a lot of functionality. My question always is, can I discover the ideas in the software? And mostly the answer is no. Those softwares do a lot of things. They keep track of a lot of actions, a lot of data. But I want to see the ideas that tell you and tell everybody how the facts will improve, how the company will transform. And seeing that and being able to read that, being able to work upon it, improve it, requires something else, which I generally don't see. Those softwares do tremendously powerful things, very friendly to use, but that specific part, like, can I understand and see the ideas, is often missing.
And I mean, you talked about this during the presentation, but why do you think it is so necessary for the ideas to be visible in the software? For example, as you alluded to, many ideas are kind of held perhaps unconsciously and explicitly, and we could not make all of those explicit. So a lot of the culture of a company, I imagine, is kind of not put into words, and people have a sense of what the culture of the company is like, but they cannot put all of that in an app. So why do you think it is important to nonetheless have ideas in the app? Why do you think it's important to have that explicit?
Yeah. Yes, indeed. You can never make all of the inexplicit knowledge explicit, but the point is to have a minimum, and a minimum that can grow. Because often we don't have this minimum, and the ideas simply reside in the minds of people, and they are radically different sometimes, even about problems or projects that people work together on. And if they are only in the minds of people, and none of it is shared, none of it is made objective, then you're far worse off than having at least some shared explicit basis. But you won't be able to get to 100% sharedness and 100% explicit. That's not possible, and that's a very fair remark. We shouldn't be aiming for it.
Right. So I think what you're imagining is something like the company goals will have to be clear, and the kind of company motto and the underlying aims of what the company is about should be made explicit enough that people can align themselves with that goal and with each other. Is that kind of what you're aiming for?
Yeah, but also drill down to what it means for specific teams in terms of goals and how they are and planning to achieve them.
Right.
Because those are derivative ideas, if you want, which should be made explicit as much as possible, both in terms of their goals and also their progress and their approach of getting towards those goals.
Right. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to make explicit the most important things and make sure that there can be alignment on, say, certain goals and certain groups working on tasks. And what you want is, I guess, for a group to know what they're working towards and to have internal alignment towards that goal. So if someone is making a website and it has to be simple and clean and accessible, then everyone in the team knows that is the aim of the task at hand. That's why they're working together, for example.
Yes, but also the goal connected to the how and connected to the why. So the how is basically the plan, the progress, and the why is the statements about why did we choose this course of action and not another one.
Right.
And so everything is connected. And for me, the idea is only an idea if it's connected both at the level of the goal, the how, and the why.
Very nice. Yeah, I see what you mean.
Which takes a lot of effort. I mean, it's easier to scribble down and it's easier to just state general goals, but it has to be connected and it has to evolve. And so it takes effort and time, but it pays off once it becomes really explicit, shared, and it starts evolving towards ever better explanations for how to reach goals in that way.
Right. So you're making the problem-solving process explicit as much as is useful. So you're saying, okay, if we made a change to the website, then it's nice to have everyone know why that change was made. And you can have a short description of why the change was made and why it helps with the achieving the task.
Yes.
And then that will help everyone else in the team to help find improvements in a similar, again, with the same aim in mind.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Very nice. Okay, we have more questions in the chat. We have one by JV. Thanks for the great presentation, Bart. Question from Joseph. What is the role of data metrics in this approach? Is it seen as inductive / about the past, or is it seen as means of error correction? For example, the use of run charts in operations or manufacturing. I'm somewhat confused about the question myself, I think, but perhaps I think you might understand it.
Well, I will have to invoke Popper to say that, well, evidence, facts, data are used to correct errors or to test explanations, but they're never the source of ideas. You cannot deduce a good idea from looking at a fact, logically impossible. So they are quite independent of each other. Only that, you know, you need to use or you need to use facts and data and evidence to check whether your explanation makes sense, and your explanation is the idea. So don't start from the facts, but use them along as means to correct your explanations going along. So no, I certainly do not want to get rid of data, but give them actually a different role.
Right. So this is a question about how data is used, and you're saying data is a criticism of plans, explanations, etc. Yeah. Makes sense.
So the explanation is about how are we going to change the facts, but you have to look at the facts to see whether you have actually changed them. But right. The facts in itself will not give you the ideas how to change them.
Very nice. We have another question. How do you actually approach companies with the idea? How are you able to find half-preparing managers to be interested?
Yes, so not by giving this presentation, because I cannot mention Popper, I cannot mention philosophy. So I have other presentations, but the basis is the same. You want to open up problem solving. You want to engage teams in cooperation around problems, problems that are important, that are at the heart of the company. But so yes, you cannot bring these types of ideas as I brought them here explicitly, because people don't know what or who Popper is, unfortunately. But there are other ways to engage in discussions that are not theoretical, that are very pragmatic. And managers relate to problem solving. I mean, at the end of the day, they also want their problems to be solved and people to be engaged. And I offer a way where you can learn that by doing in the action, not through theories or through trainings. And that catches on. And so, as I said, I found already plenty of half Popperian. I'm sure there are many more, maybe not abundant, but at least, I mean, this is not a hopeless quest.
Nice. I can imagine that for the managers, it's also somewhat of a relief because in a sense, you're asking them to do less micromanaging and to give people more freedom, which in turn creates more time for managers. And related to that is that people are now working from home due to COVID. And I imagine that that means there's less time to micromanage because you're simply not seeing each other in the workspace. So do you think that that is facilitating the kind of working from home is facilitating the kind of model that you would like companies to use? Or do you think it is the opposite? Do you think it makes it more difficult to work together and to cooperate because you are not having face-to-face interactions as much as you would otherwise have?
Yeah, I think it's the opposite rather. I regret the fact that we have to work via screens. You're changing quite and you're introducing quite a lot of new things at some pace when you adopt a method like this. And it's just a little bit more difficult when you do that over screens. For example, the tendency to let go of micromanaging is already a hurdle. It's not something that managers drop from the one day to the other. So it requires intensive discussions and time, and this is more difficult over video screens than in real life. Yeah, that's a little bit a drawback from the current situation.
That's surprising to me. I would have thought that the working from home would have made things more, maybe not easier initially, but I would have thought it would have been in alignment with the kind of model you're proposing. So that's unexpected, yeah.
Yeah, there is especially in the beginning. I mean, once we're up and running, but in the beginning, there's a lot of coaching to do for the managers. I mean, like for example, this thing that I'm helping them to arbitrate as opposed to give their own solution.
Right.
That switch requires time and some intensity. But once they get the hang of it, they really start to discover what you're saying, like the advantages of not having to micromanage anymore. But getting there, especially in the beginning, requires somewhat intensive discussions. So, which is more difficult in this context than in a context where you can have live discussions.
Right. Yeah, I guess that's another kind of transaction cost where the ideal solution is better, but you have to get there with some effort, and putting in the effort is difficult and prevents you from reaching the ideal situation immediately.
Yeah.
We have some more questions in the chat. I think I missed a couple of them, but let me see. So there's two questions from Natniel. First one is, what tools or methods do you use to persuade organizations about the power of your philosophy, or of Popper's philosophy? And second one is, how do you error correct for the 9 error correcting methods you discussed?
Yeah, the second question is a bit easier because my 9th means of error correction is basically to error correct the previous 8 ones, and always be careful whether or not the previous 8 are doing their job at error correction. And I periodically review them with management, because I also think that that is part of the discussion to have with management. If you ask them to provide the means of error correction, then those means of error correction have to do their job, and you have to systematically review that and change the setup. For example, transparency, you can decide that we're making it far too transparent too quickly. So that is built in. The first question, to persuade organizations about the power. Yeah, that's the challenge, the difficulty. But I guess I've gotten better at it than I was 5 years ago. But still, sometimes you get the remarks that, well, we do not have time for all of this. We're just being pragmatic as managers, and we don't have time for critical rationalism because we have to manage a business and be pragmatic about it. Actually, I think that justified true belief epistemology does much more harm than that. It's not simply about critical rationalism is not needed as long as we're pragmatic. It's worse than that. If managers are under pressure, then the immunization from criticism, the non-cooperation, the polarization that is growing out of justified true belief epistemology is simply making much more harm than we realize. And I have a mixture of ways of bringing that about. Again, you can't really talk directly about philosophy with managers. They're not used to that. They don't know this concept. So you have to bring them, through concrete examples and just discussions where you're also trying to ask about real life situations at the side of the company and try to understand how those things turned out, ask questions and develop like a conversation relationship and discover points of alignment and try to move on from that point, but really keep it related to real problems and how they were solved and how they could have been solved differently.
Nice. We have another question. Instead of having a manager mandate distribute problems to groups of employees, shouldn't each individual employee be able to choose which problem she is interested in working on? And that question was asked by Virginia.
Yes, that is probably the next step. So this is, for example, what this American company, Morningstar, which I briefly presented, this is what they are doing. Like any individual can decide anything that he or she wants. I don't know how they came to that situation. It probably led or was introduced through multiple small steps. We do it through mandates. So basically to give some kind of, how do you say, some kind of control still towards managers that can mandate problems, where they can say, these are my requirements for that I want to see fulfilled in a solution, because that's like an intermediate step before, letting go of everything. That wouldn't work. You also have to sometimes take into, well, not sometimes, but always take into account the culture and the situation that the company got into. And again, piecemeal improvement and piecemeal error correction. And even if that is with a very simple, small mandate, with some autonomy, but with still a lot of requirements, that's fine. We can start. We will, engage people and develop cooperation, move towards better explanations. But it can take some time, and it should take some time as well. We can't go faster than piecemeal.
Yeah, that reminds me of a thing that Joseph Agassi said last week, that a little freedom goes a long way. So I imagine
that's a nice
case here too.
I thought it was a little obedience goes a long way.
Was it? I don't think so. Really?
Yeah, and I think his point was that you don't have to micromanage people, and it won't be a disaster if you mostly let people get on with things.
Right.
Yeah. And just have a little obedience. Yes, I can relate to that.
Nice. Yeah, I was wondering, how do you find this in practice? I mean, this is kind of asked by someone earlier, but do you find that people are enthusiastic about this approach? And is it, how is it turning out practically?
Yeah. So on the positive side, people with a lot of ideas, good ideas that have never been asked the question, are really relieved that they're part of a problem-solving team where they finally can become an ID owner and receive the autonomy to pursue their ID and to be helped in that. On the other hand, in some situations also, this is so radically new that I sometimes get the remarks that, well, nobody ever asked me anything, so why would I now, take ownership? There is a lot of that as well, but you can turn that around, and that can, with the right small steps, when people feel secure enough in the beginning, you can get this momentum up and running and really see that behavior is changing, solutions are changing. So this mostly always works. It's always a matter of how much time are you willing to take to set up the dynamic and let the dynamic take off. But yeah, this always leads to something, something beautiful, something constructive, something cooperative. The question is whether it happens fast enough. That is some remarks that I sometimes get from managers. But then their alternative, like forcing everything to fix it quickly, is not making any significant progress either. So,
right. I think there's another question which I had, which is that the method of having people own a company and being responsible for the the company existing, the people being happy, there being a profit, that's a very useful construction. And I think some people might be under the impression that in your method, there are fewer people responsible. In other words, there are no longer as many people at the top who hold the power of the company, because you're kind of distributing the control down. And that would probably even from Poparians get criticisms, because of course we want people to be responsible, because we want to be able to hold them accountable for errors that they made so that they can change them, so that they're incentivized to improve their mistakes and create better theories. But I'm kind of playing devil's advocate here, because I don't actually think that that's true for your construction. But can you explain how you would respond to that?
Yeah, well, I don't think that the responsibility disappears at the point of the one who gives the mandate. I mean, they're really still responsible for ultimately arbitrating, coaching the teams to come up with good solutions. They don't have to accept anything and say, this was not my responsibility. So it's not that kind of radical a change to really dropping the responsibility at the higher levels and dumping it, so to say, at lower levels. That is at least not, I mean, the kind of reactions that I'm getting, and that's also not what I think these mandate givers should be thinking about all of this. On the contrary, they have, of course, the responsibility of instantiating the means of error correction, but they also arbitrate still around the solution, and they don't let go immediately. Any accountability to what's getting decided.
Right. So what I just sketched was basically misrepresentation of what you're suggesting, which is that there are, so in your proposal, there are really still people responsible, but it's just that the way that they go about meeting their goals and achieving their aims is that they act more efficiently by giving other people responsibilities as well, or by giving other people the opportunity to solve problems, and by alleviating some of their own not responsibilities, but their micromanaging, really.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Is that correct? Is that a way of putting it? Mm-hmm. Nice. Yeah, I like that. It's because, again, I mean, I'm in favor of people being responsible. I think that's a very important thing, and it's good to know that the method is in alignment with responsibilities and with people being in charge, even though we are giving people more freedom in the workplace. Mm-hmm. I think we're nearing the end of the event now. There's still some questions in the chat. I think we'll make this maybe the final 2 questions. So if anyone has another question, you can put it in the chat, and we'll see if we'll get there, or you can raise your hand and you can ask it yourself. So the question I'm seeing in the chat at the moment is, what are common psychological barriers to open-ended criticism that you've encountered in individuals/organizations, and how and how do you approach solving those hurdles?
Yeah, So the typical one is that psychologically you take criticism as a criticism of your personality or of your person. The way to counter that is really separating the person from the idea, the criticism about the idea. And that you have to do by spending time, by providing again, a secure environment and an openness to really separate those two things. But in difficult cultures with high pressure and with a history of blaming each other for everything that goes wrong, there is a lot of this negative psychology involved, and people take criticisms really as attacks on their person, as opposed to what I like to call them sometimes gifts of other people towards your ideas. And you can separate the two, but it takes some coaching, it takes time, but that's the way to do it. I mean, people really have to consider ideas as something like objective in between us, as opposed to their personality as a whole that is being attacked. And I think Popper writes really interesting things about that as well. And it's helpful as well to be very precise and to be very careful about how you go about the feelings that people may have of being attacked.
Right. Nice. And then we have a final question, which is, have you written a book yet? So have you written one? Have you contributed a book to one of the, what was it, 15,000 management books that don't mention?
No, not yet, actually. I haven't. I've been playing with the idea that it would be something around what I've expressed today. So yes, it's an idea I'm playing with. Maybe need some further criticism about the shape and form and the potential of these ideas to make it into a really, significant book. But it's one of my ideas I'm playing with. But I need to error test it a little bit more before I'm finally convinced that this would be valuable enough.
Excellent. Yeah, good luck. There's clearly demand in this community of people, because the chat seems eager to know about this book. And with that, I want to thank you again. I invite people to applaud again in emoji, which I enjoy. And
thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was great.